So far in this series, we've looked at the relationship between mode and melody, but there's nothing that constrains the use of mode to melody alone. We can surely come up with many more features of musical compositions derived from mode. So what I want to do to start out this particular episode is to look at a very simple melody, just part of a melody actually, and see how we can enrich it through a form of accompaniment. Likewise, what we're going to be very interested in doing is seeing how we can reach beyond the diatonic framework to do so. So to start out with, I want us to consider just an E major mode. I'll remind us of what that might sound like. And I'm going to write a short melodic segment that's only working with the first 5 notes of the scale. It's a very basic melody. More to the point, it's a purely diatonic melody. It's only working with diatonic elements from E major. Now, I can, of course, jazz it up a bit by providing an accompaniment for it. One type of accompaniment is what we call harmonization. We'll be learning specifically about musical harmony in the final episode of this series. But what I mean by that is I can come up with a whole series of notes that will support each of the melodic notes, and what I'm going to do is derive all those other notes from exactly the same resource. They are only going to come from the diatonic collection for E major. So once again, my tune is simply this. And I will now provide a harmonization for it that also only uses diatonic elements. So that melody already starts to sound a little bit more interesting. For a little bit more sense of movement, because it's a little bit chunky like that, I'm going to introduce a little bit of 8th note motion into one of the parts. Okay, so it's starting to sound more and more interesting all the time, but there's something else that I can do to take that humble diatonic melodic fragment and make it shine a little bit more. What I can do is actually begin to carefully step outside the diatonic collection. When I do that, when I introduce other pitches or pitch classes that are not diatonic, we refer to those as chromaticisms. I mean, it does literally sound like something that's a coloring of what is going to be going on in the melody. I'll give you an example of that, again, working with just the chords. The melody, once again, is simply this. My original harmonization. Okay, now we'll introduce some chromatic elements. Same idea, basic harmonization. And now I'll reintroduce that idea of a little bit of movement in an inside part. Now I have to confess, that melody, that harmonization is not mine. I've taken it from a composer named Franz Schubert, who worked in what's known as the classical era. He was a younger contemporary of Beethoven, and he's somebody who is often particularly well known for working with folk-style melodies. There's a very good reason for that. Schubert was one of the earlier composers in the movement known as musical Romanticism, which has roots in the 18th century. In particular, the idea was associated with Rousseau, his Discourse on Inequality from 1754. Rousseau kind of put out this idea that maybe people who were closer to nature were more whole as human beings, were happier, and that in some sense we ought to try to reconnect with the world of nature, with a more natural way of living, to feel more satisfied with our lives and more realized as individuals. So one thing that you had in response to that was a very powerful message. Many people were really taken with it. A response to that in the musical realm was for many composers and performers to get interested in music that either was literally folk music, not classical, but music from the countryside in some sense, or music that would pretend to be kind of folk-like. So one thing that was used to create songs that would seem like folk songs were often these very simple diatonic melodies. So Schubert often liked to use melodies that themselves were purely diatonic. However, as a very sophisticated composer, what he liked to do was introduce chromaticisms underneath in the accompaniment to enrich it in some way. And I think that's exactly what we heard here. We started out with a basic tune. I gave a very straightforward diatonic harmonization of it. And then finally we get the Schubert touch. So I'm sure you can actually hear where the harmonization departs from the diatonic. First here, originally I played just this. That would be a diatonic harmonization, but this is so much more interesting. Instead of having a D sharp and an F sharp, which would be diatonic to E major, Schubert has a D natural and an E sharp. And then at this point, instead of hanging on to a diatonic C sharp, he lowers it to what would be a chromatic C natural. So with the introduction of just 3 chromatic elements, Schubert is able to completely transform the impact, the character, the atmosphere of this melody. So chromaticism is something that we would like to get to know. Now, unfortunately, it is the elephant in the room. It's a massive topic. We're only going to be able to grab the tail of the elephant in this course. Chromaticism, to really understand it, takes, I would say, at least a good 2 years of study of harmony at least. But what we want to do is to be able to begin to recognize chromaticism when it intrudes on a diatonic space, and to be able to understand why it is doing so and how it is doing so. Now, this particular example is based on a major mode, E major. Chromaticism can be used in minor modes as well. And in fact, when we're introduced to chromaticism, usually it's through the context of minor mode melodies. And there's a particular reason for that. Some of the most conventional, most frequent forms of the uses of chromaticism are encountered in minor mode melodies, particularly in the upper reaches of the scale. So for a course like this, what we do next to actually introduce some basic models for chromaticism is to look at a minor scale and then to see what kinds of changes might be made to that scale that serve as models for chromaticism for departure from the diatonic. So we're going to be learning about types of scales known as the melodic minor and the harmonic minor. That is our introduction to the concept of chromaticism, but remember, that is to teach us some useful models to kind of open our awareness of the possibility for chromaticism. But the example that I've just been playing for you by Schubert, that's not in a minor mode, it's not working with minor scales. Chromaticism extends well beyond that. One of the things that we will do after we've introduced ourselves to the notion of chromaticism is to reconsider the diatonic framework in itself. Do we have to just stick with diatonic enhanced through chromaticism, or can we kind of wipe the board clean and consider completely new possibilities for types of mode? So we'll get to that after the discussion, introductory discussion of chromaticism in the context of a minor mode. So what you'll see on the board behind me are some familiar scales. I have a D minor scale, I have a D major scale. I've written another D minor scale for reasons that we'll get to in a little bit. The first thing I want to do is just remind ourselves how your basic minor and major sound in relation to each other. So here is D minor, and here is D major. than going over all of the interval details, I just want to focus on one component, and that is this. The first 5 notes of each scale. I'm going to a little bit better pen. Okay, so what we have are the first 5 pitches. And just like we've used the term tetrachord before to describe a collection of 4 notes that are related to each other in stepwise fashion, so a combination of whole tones and semitones. Our particular interest was the diatonic tetrachord, where we had a whole tone, and a semitone. We can focus on these 5 notes and refer to them as the pentachord, the lower pentachord for these scale types. And when we do that, we notice one thing in particular. They have one distinction between them, and that is at the 3rd scale degree, F and F sharp. So what distinguishes major from minor in that sense is that 3rd. So if I want to create something that's going to sound plausibly minor to me, the first thing that I would want to do is get rid of this. Now, one thing that happens frequently with minor scales is that some kind of alteration is made to the 7th scale degree. There's a reason for that. If I play the scale as though it were implying a melodic structure of some kind, that is to say, where I'm imagining that there's an implication of a tonic underneath serving as a kind of framework for melodic activity up above. If I come to the 7th scale degree there, so stepping outside the pentachord, so I'm playing the tonic once more underneath, I have a type of interval called the 7th. I will be modifying that term in the very next episode, but it's a kind of 7th that sounds dissonant but not terribly exciting. I could imagine my melody going up, I could imagine my melody going down. I don't feel like that 7th scale degree really drives me in any particular direction. If we compare that to the major, so I will restore the sharp there. Sharp dissonance, and given the implication of a tonic underneath, I can be convinced that that particular pitch wants to drive upwards to rejoin the tonic of the melody. So it invests it with a lot more energy. Now, when we come to talk about harmony, we'll discover that there are good reasons as well for having something like this, a semitone away from your goal of arrival. We call these things tendency tones. They seem to have a tendency that drives in a particular direction. So there's a way in which that power of the 7th scale degree in a major mode is something that could be desirable sometimes in a minor context. And for that reason, when we have minor mode melodies, often what we will uncover is a change to the 7th scale degree, something that will make it sound more like it was a major scale. That 7th, deriving it from the major scale, let's call it a major 7th. I'll explain specifically what that means in the next episode, but that major 7th is something that really propels a melody upwards to get back to the tonic. I might want to borrow that for the minor context. And so what I've done by removing the sharp is actually created something that sounds like a minor mode that momentarily behaves as though it's major when it gets up here. Notice how this 6th scale degree is also a semitone higher from what it was before. Now, this type of alteration, when the 7th scale degree is raised by semitone, we specifically call it a leading tone. Like it is leading the ear to get back to the tonic, something like that. So in this case, if I were to play just a D major scale, and and then remove that third F sharp that comes from the major mode. I'll call it the major third for now. Turn it to the minor version. Note how I only need to make one change for this to sound like, yes, this is a minor mode, but something is momentarily kind of getting my ear to move upwards. Now, if I wanted to kind of calm things down a bit and restore the sense of conventional minor, what I can do is restore the diatonic pitches that I would normally use for plain old vanilla Aeolian minor mode. And in fact, there's a new term that I can use to describe that, given the idea that chromatic alterations are quite common in a minor context. We could refer to this as the diatonic minor. The modern terminology has come to rest upon the term natural, to say the natural minor, meaning natural as diatonic. This is what it would naturally be without chromaticism being applied to it at the 6th and 7th scale degrees. So keep in mind that relative to the natural or diatonic minor, in this case, the 6th and 7th scale degrees have been raised by semitone. And in fact, if I then take a look at just, I'll use this segment, I'll notice something interesting in the structure. I actually have one of those little diatonic tetrachords, whole tone, semitone, and I also have it turned upside down through what we call melodic inversion, moving this away, whole tone, semitone. So it's rather like the use of chromaticism as it moves up is drawing my ear up toward the tonic, and then as I move downwards, the restoration of the diatonic 6th scale degree, that's only a semitone away from the 5th scale degree, and so again I have that semitone away from another goal of motion. So I have something that draws my ear upwards, and then to allow that melodic line, if you will, to descend, I take away the energy of the leading tone, I restore the diatonic 6th and 7th scale degrees, and again, as I get close to that 5th scale degree, if I'm a semitone away, it's like my ear is being led back down to it. So this is really the first model for chromaticism that we need to learn about, because it's something that we call the melodic minor. It shows the kind of typical use of chromaticism that we would encounter in a minor mode melody. And what I really like about it is that it's an extremely useful mode, because if you want to learn about a minor mode from a major, all you need to do is take your original major, which starts with this, remove that third from the major, and you have the foundation for this chromatically altered minor scale. But you know that all you have to do is restore the 6th and 7th scale degrees on your way down. So you create a major scale, remove that major third, and then once you've reached that point, when you come down, you'll know that you take whatever were the 6th and 7th scale degrees, they were chromatic alterations, restore them by moving them down a semitone, and you generate, of course, your diatonic or natural minor. So this is why when I've taught young students, as I sometimes have in the past, how to learn scales, rather than getting them to read from books of music that show them scales and what accidentals to use and all the rest of it, I get them familiar with the idea of the diatonic tetrachord, because then they can create a major scale anywhere, whole tone, semitone, jump up another whole tone, and they can create that again. They can see exactly what accidentals they need. And then, of course, to turn it into minor, all they need to do is lower the third scale degree, keeping everything else the same. And then when they come down, lower the 7th and 6th scale degrees. And now they know what their parallel minor mode is. And in that case, as you've probably already figured out, I can then show them how to derive their Lydian and Mixolydian modes, and then the Dorian, Phrygian, and Locrian. So this is why the melodic minor scale is fantastically useful, not just for the particular melodic context in which we might encounter it. And we will be looking at an example of that from the course notes after this segment, so we can see how the analysis can help us to interpret what might otherwise seem a pretty complex use of accidentals. But aside from that musical context, the melodic minor becomes our bridge from the major camp to the minor camp, and a way in which we can very quickly generate all 7 diatonic modes given any single tonic. So keep that in mind. It's an extremely useful skill in music theory to have access to. All right, so this is the so-called melodic minor, which starts out looking exactly like a major scale, except with that lowered third scale degree. But when it comes down, we get the diatonic, or so-called natural minor, which of course is what I originally gave up here. Therefore, when I look at something like this, it is another opportunity for me to introduce chromaticism. Once again, I'm going to extend this pentachord box down here. We're going to notice that nothing in these models of chromaticism, nothing happens in that lower pentachord. Everything takes place in the upper 4 notes. We could call that the upper tetrachord, that they overlap the pentachord and the tetrachord. So the changes are up here. In this case, what I would apply, in fact, what I'm going to do to make the chromaticism clear, I'm going to use a different colored pen for those chromatic accidentals. I've just raised the leading tone. I've just done that. It's a familiar type of scale that we call the harmonic minor. And the reason why it gets called that is because, as we will see in the final episode of this series, when you start to create chords, harmonies that go with melodies in a minor mode, one thing that you will very frequently be doing is raising that 7th scale degree, turning it into a leading tone for the purposes of a very important type of harmony that we call the dominant harmony. But there are other harmonies like that that would also make use of it. So this really reflects conventional harmonic practice. That's where that term comes from. This reflects conventional melodic practice in a minor mode. And so this is why the term is referred to as melodic minor. The use of chromaticism depends on the direction of the melody. If the melody is going up between scale degrees 5, 6, 7, and 8, as it moves up, that's where you apply chromaticism. However, if a melody is moving down from, I think I might have said 8, scale degree 1, of course, scale degree 7, 6, back to 5, if it's going down, then you want to restore the natural diatonic elements. So the use of chromaticism depends on direction of the melodic line. Okay, so with this information in place, the next thing that we want to do is look at a minor mode melody that is making use of chromaticisms, and then we want to see how these particular models for chromaticism can help us to understand that melody. That ultimately is what these things are. They are the most basic models for introducing concepts of chromatic use. I want to emphasize that these are just introductory models. The Joplin that I played for you, which is in a major mode, that made lots of use of chromaticism. The Schubert Arpeggione slow movement intro that I played for you, that is also something that is in a major mode. So it's not the case that you only have chromaticism in a minor mode, let alone that you only have chromaticism in the 6th and 7th scale degrees, right? This is just an introduction to the kind of chromaticism you can anticipate seeing. And then as you come to have more experience with music, as you come to know more harmony, you'll discover that chromaticism can appear on any scale degree at any point in time. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do now is pop into the course online notes themselves and listen to a particular example. I'm going to play a melody from our course notes. The original melody is by a British composer who lived in the Baroque era, in the late 17th century. His name was Henry Purcell. He lived from 1659 to 1695. I've adapted the melody in some ways to kind of enhance the aspects of chromaticism that we are especially interested in. The tune itself was used again by a later British composer named Benjamin Britten as the theme for his Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. That's a piece that was used to introduce not necessarily young listeners, but I would say inexperienced listeners to the various instruments that are used in a conventional symphony orchestra. And for that reason, I'm using this recording that I made of it with simple QuickTime instrumentation because it sounds a little bit more like the original idea with trumpet. So here it is. So probably the first thing I notice about this melody is, aside from all the notes that are there, I'm getting some conflicting information. I see both sharps and flats. There's even a natural there. Right away, that would tell me that this cannot be completely derived from a single diatonic mode or single diatonic collection. I would then like to understand why I'm getting this mixed information. So for example, sometimes I'm getting C naturals, as you can see there. Other times I'm getting C sharps. Sometimes I'm getting B flats. Other times I'm getting B naturals. What can account for this mixed information? The first thing I want to do in a situation like this is look at the piece as a whole. Fortunately, this one isn't that long, and see if I can't pick up some framing information for it. I can't help noticing that this melody both begins and ends with D, so that suggests that D is the tonic for the melody as a whole. I also notice that with these first three notes, there's something about that that reminds me of the pentachord for any of the models of minor scale that we were working with, whether we were talking about natural minor or melodic minor or harmonic minor. It's rather like I'm playing the first, third, and fifth notes and leaving out the second and fourth. And then indeed, if I continued on from there, this would sound like a D minor scale, but a very particular one, D melodic minor, the ascending version of it. And coincidentally, if I look over here, I have what I would also expect from a melodic minor scale, which is to say the 7th and 6th scale degrees in their diatonic form. So if I look back and forth across these two measures, this appears to be that version of a minor scale where the 6th and 7th scale degrees are raised when we move from the 5th scale degree up through the 6th and 7th back to the tonic again. And then when we go in the opposite direction from the tonic down through the 7th, 6th to the 5th scale degrees, we reverse that process. So again, that diatonic tetrachord, if you will, whole tone, semitone, and then we turn it upside down, whole tone, semitone. So this looks exactly like that model of the D melodic minor scale that we explored in the previous segment. Therefore, if I look elsewhere in this melody, I'm probably going to start getting some understanding of these other kinds of features. I can see literally a scale here, almost literally a scale there with a couple of bits missing out, but there can be ways in which there are implicit contributions from something like the melodic minor model of chromaticism. So here, for example, I have the outline of the opening motive here, which tends to isolate that D. C. So if I played these highlighted notes, again, this suggests that natural minor contour, which I would get especially in descent from a melodic minor scale. Now, of course, I could just say that all of this portion can be understood solely in terms of the natural minor scale. No need to consider chromaticism there, but I'm interested in the context of the melody as a whole. And I see that when the notes are moving upwards, either literally there or implicitly from there to there, they're doing exactly what I would expect from chromatic alteration in a minor mode, where the seventh scale degree becomes this leading tone that then is just a semitone away from the tonic. And then to be able to go down, we release that chromaticism, return this to just plain old seventh, scale degree 7 of the scale, plain old scale degree 6 of the scale, and all the way down. The whole melody now no longer offers any kind of confusion. I have a total of 9 pitch classes being used because I've doubled up on my C's. I have a C natural, a C sharp, a B natural, and a B flat. But I understand their relationship to each other. The framing diatonic collection is this one, D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C. And then there are changes where I would expect them to occur with scale degrees 6 and 7. So in this way, the model of chromaticism presented to me by the melodic minor scale has helped me to take what at first sight appears to be a relatively complex melody and to kind of filter it into its component parts, diatonic and chromatic. So I'd like us to step back for a moment and get kind of a bigger picture of the possibilities for types of mode. And one of the things that we want to focus on is how many pitch class elements do we actually get to work with to create our modal sequences. For example, when I think about something like a C major scale, I have something that is working with 7 pitch class elements. I have kind of 7 toys to play with. And I call them pitch class elements because remember, whether I play the C major scale down here or up here, I'm hearing that same collection of elements being used and strung out in a particular sequence. So I can say that one thing that a major scale and a Dorian scale and a Mixolydian scale all have in common is they're working with 7 things. So there's a way in which I could describe all the diatonic modes as being heptatonic, meaning that they have 7 pitch class elements that they play with. And in fact, I can start to create a map using that idea of the number of pitch class elements each mode is working with and organizing in a particular way. So what I've drawn on the board is a whole series of these things. PC is just the shorthand we normally use in music theory to describe pitch class. So number of pitch class elements, heptatonic, Hepta meaning 7. Tonic, you can think of tones in that way. Tone as a kind of more old-fashioned term for the pitch class. You might have heard of 12-tone music. That's referring to the idea of 12 pitch classes being used. Okay, so heptatonic, and we have a particular example of that given over here. Diatonic, I'm just using that term in general because, of course, we have 7 mode types. Each of them is heptatonic. We'll discover that there's also another type of mode that you can work with, the diminished whole tone, which, even though it's working with the same number of elements, organizes them in a different way and therefore offers a distinctive type of mode. There are these other very common types, pentatonics, hexatonics, octatonics, dodecatonic. These ones have particular examples given for them over here. Sometimes you'll see the same word being used twice, and that's because there's a particular version of one of these collections of pitch class elements that's become the most popular. So for example, there are many different types of pentatonic, and there is one in particular that became extraordinarily popular, not just in folk music, but in all sorts of classical musics, both Eastern and Western, and as a result, that came to be known as the pentatonic, even if there were many different types of pentatonic. As we'll discover, the type that became especially popular is known as the anhemitonic pentatonic. That anhemitonic term means that it's something without semitones, and that's going to be very important. Here we see something called an octatonic. We see as a particular example of it the term octatonic being given. Again, that refers to a specific type of octatonic mode that happens to have become the most popular, the most widely used, so it was simply given that name. By the way, these terms which refer to the number of elements that are being used, you can think of these as being types of set. We refer to that as the cardinality of the set, the number of elements that it has to work with. So these are particular orderings of that available set of elements. At the far end, we have the dodecatonic, dodeca meaning 12. So dodecatonic is another way of saying 12 tone. And that is something that represents sort of complete saturation of the available pitch class elements, all 12 that we have available to us. So what I want to do next is actually start to look into some of these particular examples and see what they look like, see how they sound. When I can, I will connect them with actual musical compositions, because our interest in these types of mode tends to come from particular compositions by composers like Claude Debussy, for example, who made very evocative use of them. And that's why musicians got interested in them. That's why they became a core component of modern theory courses. It's because musicians were inspired by the sound qualities of them. And I want to emphasize that because this part of the course could seem to be exceptionally dry if we just look at these things as sequences of intervals. The whole idea is to create a musical effect or atmosphere of some kind. Now, a couple of things I can tell you before I get down to that, and that is some of these, because of the number of elements they work with, you'll see that they lend themselves to being particularly asymmetric and therefore offering a wide variety of mode organization. So for example, heptatonic suggests right away, if I have 7 elements out of a possible total number of 12, well, that is a possible organization that will admit a lot of combinations of whole tones and semitones. So for example, the diatonic modes that we're familiar with, those are not the only possible orderings, but one of the things that we know about them is that they have as many modes as they have elements in each collection. So that suggests a high degree of asymmetry, and that's of interest to us because that also produces a wide variety of intervals. Likewise, if I look at the anhemitonic pentatonic, it sounds like maybe there's going to be less possibilities for asymmetry because I have only 5 elements to work with, so maybe that's fewer opportunities to create different sizes of interval. Well, one thing that does come out of it nonetheless is a particular ordering that has the same fundamental characteristics as the diatonic modes. The anhemitonic pentatonic is wonderfully popular for at least one reason, and that is that it also has as many modes as it has elements, so it's an exceptionally rich collection. The other thing, though, that made it very popular was precisely the fact that it doesn't have semitones, unlike the diatonic mode types. But we shouldn't mistake the organization of these modes in scales for what they can offer to composers. For example, if I consider something like the dodecatonic, we simply refer to that as a chromatic scale if we play it in that fashion. It's not a very interesting scale, it's just semitone after semitone after semitone. As a scale, it has only one mode type. There's no possible way to have different modes of just complete semitones all the time. Nonetheless, as a collection to work from, what the chromatic scale is doing is putting in scale form all the available pitch classes we have to work with, and that is something that has proven to be extraordinarily rich. So you can't always judge the fecundity of the mode types through their scales. There are often hidden properties that they have. So what we're going to want to do is listen to particular examples of each of them, and what I'm going to start out with are the ones that are actually more symmetrical than not. I'm going to be starting out with the chromatic scale, and I'm going to be starting with a particular version of hexatonic, the whole tone scale, so that we can get our ears familiar with really pure symmetrical scale types and then the kind of music that could be created from them. This will be our opportunity to hear a few excerpts by Debussy, and then from there I will move to something that's a little less purely symmetrical, but nonetheless has enough symmetry in it that it offers a kind of midway point between these purely symmetrical scale types and something that has a mixture of whole tones and semitones, the diatonic. And that's going to be this special octatonic, or as it's sometimes known, diminished scale. And then I will want us to take a look at the pentatonic, specifically the anhemitonic pentatonic, because that surprisingly is closely connected with the kind of musical or aesthetic impact that Debussy was interested in creating through things like his use of whole tone scale. So this is something that can sound very much like or can be used for a folk, what would sound like a folk melody or folk tune or something like that, and yet a composer like Debussy was interested in it for avant-garde possibilities. And then the last thing that we'll look at are hybrid scale types, where instead of saying, all right, I'm going to just stick with one mode or the other, or the other, or the other, I'm going to see if I can take component parts of different ones and put them together and see what results. And often we'll find that there are these novel results that we might not even be aware of just how popular they are, but something like the diminished whole tone scale, which at first introduction looks like a really strange beast. Nonetheless, it's a type of scale that we encounter all around us in pop and jazz music, as well as in classical and other forms of contemporary music. So this is a big picture for us. What we're now going to do is start looking at particular examples, and again, I'll be working from the course website, the online course notes that we have, and I'll try to supplement that with some recordings, a couple of short ones for obvious copyright concerns. I can't do a lot of that, unfortunately. Plus, I might play a little bit more on the piano, too. So the first type of non-diatonic mode that we're going to look at is the perfectly symmetrical chromatic scale. This is a new use of the term chromatic for us. The scale is one that, as you can see, is composed purely of semitones. And in that sense, we might better understand it as the semitone scale. What you can do to make sense of the use of the term chromatic here is think of what we used to have as a distinction between a diatonic collection and chromatic elements that are distinct from it. So the diatonic for C, the chromatic collection that could be juxtaposed against it. We could imagine the chromatic scale being the result of the sort of intercalation of the diatonic and the chromatic. So moving from C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and C. Okay? So that is a different use of the term chromatic. Chromatic scale is referring to this sequential organization of all available pitch classes. As a scale, it's going to be within an octave. One of the reasons for getting interested in chromatic collections is precisely the fact that they tend to undermine a clearly defined sense of tonic, that the more we freely interchange the use of all 12 pitch classes, the harder it is to gain a clear impression of a distinct underlying tonic. The reason for that is that a diatonic mode has a fundamental asymmetry that connects semitones and whole tones together into one space, but they are being combined irregularly, and this is why it's possible to recognize where you are in a diatonic mode because of the irregularity in the sequence of semitones and whole tones. If you have a gradual impression being formed in your ear of all of these things being used equally, at no point are you going to be able to tell really where you should stop to arrive at a tonic. Everything is equidistant from everything else in that kind of background framework. Now, if we extend that idea in another direction, we can get something like this. Instead of pure semitones, we can have pieces of music that are based purely on whole tone segments. So here is an example that comes from a symphonic poem written by Debussy called La Mer, the Sea, and this is from a part of that tone poem where a storm has come up. So what I'm going to do is play the example from the website just for the fun of it, because it sounds a little bit jazzy when I have QuickTime instruments plucking away at it. Here we go. Now, it is possible to organize these kinds of whole tone collections as scales. But what you'll notice is that Debussy seems to want to use the whole tone collection precisely because it doesn't provide any sense of orientation for our ears. I mean, literally, we are at sea without an anchor of any kind. There's no apparent tonic. If I actually collect all of these notes together in sequence as though I were working with a scale, one thing that I'll notice is that there is this enharmonic equivalence between D flat and C sharp, E flat and D sharp. That's from Debussy's original notation. And it really doesn't matter in that sense whether you're using sharps or flats. What I notice is that as the melody moves up high, then he decides he wants to use sharps. When it's moving into a lower range, he decides to use flats. So it's rather like flat is indicating going down into the base of these crests of waves, and sharps are when we're rising over the top. What Debussy seems to want to do is give our ears a sense of dislocation, not knowing exactly where we are, just like if we're at sea in a boat that's being tossed around by heavy waves, we can lose our sense of the horizon, we can lose our sense of how to navigate the space we're being tossed around, and some people can become, of course, quite ill from this. There's no way that Debussy could give the impression of being kind of lost at sea, storm-tossed amongst all these waves, working with standard major and minor modes. So it's for a very particular compositional or musical effect that Debussy is choosing to use this whole tone collection. Yes, I can arrange all of its elements in a scale-like pattern, but you'll notice that I'm not bothering to begin and end it with
the same and harmonically equivalent pitch class, because Debussy himself isn't working in that kind of clearly defined space. The whole point seems to be a loss of a sense of orientation and direction. So what I want to explore next with this is a further example of Debussy's use of whole tone collections. And in that case, I will play from the piano, because I'm going to work with a piano piece that Debussy wrote, not set in the C in this case, but nonetheless wanting to give an impression of a sense of dislocation, a sense of alienation that can't be captured by diatonic means.
Interrupt that musical dream right there. This is a piece by Claude Debussy. It's from his second volume of Images for piano. It's called La cloche à travers les feuilles. It's roughly meaning a clock, a chiming outdoor clock of some kind, heard through leaves, I imagine, falling leaves. And Debussy is trying to create an atmosphere that he feels he can't reach through conventional diatonic means. One of the things that we use to characterize diatonic scales is, of course, the tonic. And when we learn how to play diatonic scales on an instrument like the piano, everything is framed by the tonic. How we move our fingers is determined by that. If I'm starting out with my thumb, I want to come back to the same fingering later on. So when I learn scales like that, it's always patterned in that way according to the tonic that I'm working with. Likewise, as musicians, when we're introduced to whole tone modes, typically what we're given are scale patterns. And the reason for that is we want to learn how to play them using the same kind of regularly sequenced fingerings. Now, if I'm working with something like a plain vanilla diatonic scale, I have 7 pitch classes to work with. So in my mind, I think, okay, I'm going to use 3 fingers and then 4, 3 and then 4. If I have a whole tone collection to work with, there are only 6 pitch class elements to work with, and so I can't use the same kinds of fingerings. Sometimes I can have some nice continuous fingerings like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Other times that's not available to me, and I have to do other funny kinds of fingerings like 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, right? So there's a way in which, as a piano player, I was trained to hear whole tone music in terms of these scales, even though the whole idea of a whole tone mode was to get away from that sense of a clearly defined framework. And so that's why I think in a piece of music like this, even if we are hearing scale-like fragments like we have at the beginning, obviously I have something that's going down step by step by step and then up step by step by step, but I don't really have a sense of that being a scale in any conventional sense, that either of those notes function as a tonic. They're kind of turnaround points, as though I'm simply oscillating in space, in whole tone space. Likewise, when I have the outer melody introduced by Debussy up here, this is something that is moving in the opposite direction. So when when this thing turns its corner from going up, it suddenly turns down. That's at the same time that the other part turns its corner. So while one goes down, the other goes up, and then they abruptly turn, kind of like schools of fish that you see in those undersea documentaries where they abruptly turn without any kind of pause, without seemingly any sense of goal, just flickering through the waters. And by the way, the collection Image 2 ends with a fish piece, goldfish, which is absolutely wonderful. Anyhow, what Debussy is creating here is a world of possibility that for the time being is clouded in mist. I say mist because it's all derived from a single whole tone collection. And this is something that can leave one feeling a little bit bewildered in a way, and without a sense of direction. So we have this slow pattern being established at the start. We'll have a new melodic idea going in the opposite direction. And on the inside, something that sounds a little bit more scale-like because it moves within an octave. Put them together. So far is just melodic in that sense. So there's kind of a weaving together of these three melodic whole tone segments. Then Debussy does something that's rather like what Schubert did in the Arpeggione Sonata that we were considering at the start of this episode. You might remember there that we were talking about deriving a melody from a single collection. So that was the E major collection, had a simple melody. I discovered that, well, I don't have to leave the melody by itself. I can actually come up with harmonies that are derived from that same collection. So Debussy starts to do the same kind of thing in Cloche à travers les feuilles. So after this passage, he suddenly starts to collect more notes together. So what I have are, again, you could call them harmonies that are based on this underlying whole tone collection. So even though we are escaping the notion of the diatonic by working totally within a whole tone space, nonetheless, we see a similar kind of compositional practice taking place where harmonies are being developed that match with the type of melody that we're working with. They're derived from this same whole tone segment. Now, we might also remember that Schubert did not stick with the purely diatonic harmonization of his melody. So, just like Schubert introduces things outside the home collection, which we call chromaticisms, Debussy starts to do the same kind of thing. So we move from purely one type of whole tone world from a different whole tone collection rather than the one that Debussy has been working with up to that point in time. So just like you can have the intrusion of something from the outside that we call chromaticism in the context of a diatonic framework like Schubert was using, Debussy can pull the same trick when he's working with these whole tone collections. So that is going to be the seed for some new musical possibility, because in a way, it's an interesting idea. I feel a little bit like Debussy is setting up an imaginative framework for himself, and he's just going to kind of follow where his ear and his imagination takes him in that space. So he's kind of exploring it for a while, things that he can do with it. I can have different melodic fragments layered together. Now I can start to develop types of harmonies out of that. But he's going to need something new so that he can introduce, in some sense, a kind of musical problem to work with. And so it's going to be that little seed that's thrown in like a flash of lightning, a little spark. But you can miss it because it goes by so quickly. So what happens is Debussy introduces the possibility for some new terrain to explain in the subtlest way imaginable. And of course, it's very characteristic of Debussy's art. And where I broke off the segment that I was playing is where Debussy decides definitively to move on and start exploring new musical terrain. But I just wanted us to have some sense of how you can build a kind of larger musical world out of some very simple components. In this case, just working with a single whole tone collection, done in a way that creates a tremendous sense of atmosphere, of possibility, of not knowing exactly where it is you're going. It sounds like a very creative space to be moving within. And this is one reason why we study whole tone scales, not to learn scales per se, but to become familiar with this possibility for musical exploration. Now, one of the things that really radically distinguishes whole tone space from diatonic space is whole tone, by definition, is just working with one size of interval throughout. And therefore, we can say, well, obviously, this is radically opposed to the diatonic framework where we're mixing up semitones and whole tones. However, the next type of mode that we're going to be looking at is quite a curious one because it also uses a combination of semitones and whole tones to define its musical space, but not in a way where you end up with the diatonic result. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is the octatonic mode, which uses semitones and whole tones like the diatonic, but not in a diatonic way. It's going to create, again, a sense of alienation, just like we get in this opening to La Cloche à travers les feuilles. Therefore, what we're going to be doing is listening once again to a musical example by Debussy that is making use of an octatonic mode to see the kind of effect or impact that it has. Because as we proceed through this, we're going to be getting more information about these non-diatonic modes, but what I'm really hoping we will not lose track of is the reason why we're interested in them. There are these atmospheric effects that a composer like Debussy is striving to achieve by using these new means. So let's keep track of the compositional purposes behind these types of modes and see what new interesting sounds we can come up with.
Let's start this segment by listening to some more music by Debussy. In this case, it's written for full orchestra. It's a piece called Nuages, or Clouds. So the first thing that we're going to listen to is the very opening of Clouds. We'll start out with a gentle introduction, and at the end of that particular excerpt that I'll play for you, we will hear a theme played by the English horn, which you can see on the screen before you. So what we heard was that melody, which does sound intriguing in lots of different ways. One of the things I notice about it that's quite different from the opening to La Cloche à travers les feuilles is that where that work created its effects by staying solely within the confines of a whole tone collection, something else significant seems to be going on here. I seem to be having the use of both semitones and whole tones in a sense like I would expect from an ordinary diatonic collection. However, it doesn't sound like a conventional major or minor or any other type of diatonic mode. And in fact, if I summarize the pitches that I'm working with, I can see something quite striking. There are two semitones and two whole tones. So there's a regular alternation of whole tones and semitones, and in fact, at no point in a conventional diatonic mode would I expect to see semitones so close to each other. There's something about this pattern that suggests an underlying mode type that is pretending to be a little bit like a diatonic mode, but it is a little too regular, a little too symmetrical to be that. If I extended this idea, I would come up with this complete scale. And just to emphasize the use of the semitones, I'll connect those to each other. And if I count up the number of pitch classes that I'm working with, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 before I return to 1 again. So that is 1 too many for a diatonic collection. We have 8 pitch classes in total. This is an example of what we call an octatonic mode. And there are 2 types of mode that are available for the octatonic. I can have either the type I've just heard, which is whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone, or I can reverse the process and have semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone. The other one, the original one that Debussy was working with, was this. So what's quite striking about the octatonic is that unlike a whole tone collection or whole tone mode, which only works with one type of interval, the whole tone, the octatonic is blending semitones and whole tones, and in that sense is suggestive of a kind of diatonic framework, but plainly it cannot be due to the regularity with which it alternates the whole tones and the semitones. So the octatonic was a very special type of mode that Debussy favored a great deal, in part, I think, because it could suggest the possibility for something diatonic, but would constantly recede from actually providing a clear sense of tonic for listeners, although there are certainly ways in which one could give the impression of a tonic. But the idea seemed to be that as a listener, we would be drawn into this type of mode through its familiar features, the alternations of whole tones and semitones, and yet be left bewildered by the fact that they weren't arrayed in a conventional fashion. Now, this idea was something that was extremely popular. Debussy made tremendous use of it, but he inspired other composers to do the same thing, composers like Bela Bartok and Igor Stravinsky, both of whom went to Paris, both of whom found Debussy's music to be extremely productive in providing them with models for their type of composition. So we see the octatonic being used by a lot of composers around the turn of the 20th century, and we'll also discover ways in which segments of the octatonic get used later on as part of more recognizably modern non-diatonic scale types. One thing I'll point out is that the octatonic is also known as the diminished scale. Diminished intervals are something that we're going to be talking about in the very next episode, episode 8. But one thing that you can get with diminished intervals is the creation of something called a diminished seventh. And if I have another diminished seventh produced, for example, starting a whole tone away, those two together actually create the very scale that we're looking at right there. So this is why sometimes people will use the term diminished mode to refer to the octatonic. And in fact, that is the term that we're going to use later on with a hybrid known as the diminished whole tone. But I'll explain that to you later in this episode. The next thing that we want to do is look at another mode type that Debussy worked with to create a similar sense of enticement and confusion. It's something that did the opposite, in a sense, of the octatonic. The octatonic is introducing semitones to try to beguile listeners into thinking that there's something vaguely diatonic here. The next thing we're going to be looking at is the pentatonic mode that Debussy especially liked, known as the anhemitonic pentatonic. That is something that behaves a little bit more like the whole tone modes because the anhemitonic pentatonic also has no semitones employed at all. So it's kind of the next logical one to move to. And in fact, Debussy makes that move in this very piece, Clouds, as we'll hear in the next segment. So what we're going to listen to now is from a little bit later in that orchestral piece, Clouds. It's a theme that's quite striking because when many people listen to it, they often have a sense of something oriental being conveyed. Let's listen to it carefully. So what we've heard is something that is not like the other melodies we've encountered. The melody is moving around quite a lot and not in a particularly scale-like fashion. If we were to summarize the kind of notes that Debussy is working with in one place, we would discover something like this, that the melody is moving over a funny kind of structure that has just 5 pitch classes and that has these gaps in key places. What I'm showing you right here is how you can take one of these collections. So Debussy is working with something like this. I'm shifting everything down by semitone. And if I take that collection and put it through rotations, just like I did with the old diatonic mode as I initially introduced it, you'll see something quite striking. There are 5 pitch class elements here. That would make it a pentatonic in some sense. But likewise, if I play first the collection starting with C, then starting with D, then starting on E, then on G, and then finally on A, I discover that, like the diatonic modes, this type of pentatonic mode has as many modes as there are elements in any given collection. So I have 5 pitch classes and I have 5 possible orderings of it. I'm just calling those orderings modes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, for a course like this, I would not expect you to know these modes individually. This is something a little bit different than our knowledge of the diatonic modes. I just want to make the point clear that this type of pentatonic is extremely rich with respect to mode, and I think that's one of the reasons why it became so popular. You get a maximum amount of interval and mode variety out of just one collection. So this particular type of pentatonic is called the anhemitonic pentatonic, which I've referred to before. Anhemitonic meaning that there are no semitones. And in fact, you can see where there are no semitones because I've put boxes around them. For example, if I was playing mode 1 and filling in the boxes, what I did is introduce an F and a B there. And if I did that, I would get a semitone relationship between E and F, and of course between B and C. By removing the F and the B, I not only remove semitones, but that interval feature that most listeners would use to recognize where they are in the context of a diatonic mode. So this is not exactly the same thing as working with a whole tone collection. But nonetheless, what the anhemitonic pentatonic provides is a kind of modal space in which our ear is not allowed to search out and hang on to conventional semitones. So, what do we make of this? Well, it's possible, of course, to use anhemitonic pentatonics as though they could have a tonic of some kind, and I created a melody like that here. This melody begins with C, it ends with C. It's very easy for me to hear this as being in a kind of C pentatonic. I might be tempted to say it sounds rather like C major, but missing a couple of notes. And in fact, that's the kind of comparison that these mode types do invite. So I purposely paced the playing of the pentatonic mode 1 so that your ear would provide that hidden diatonic contribution, the thing that would make semitones become present. I can do the same thing with a couple of the other pentatonic mode types. So for example, this is a natural minor beginning on A. And you can hear how pentatonic mode 5 could be heard to imply a kind of minor mode. Likewise, I could do the same thing with pentatonic mode 3. So part of the attraction for the anhemitonic pentatonic is that it is a way to gradually let slip the bonds of diatonic mode without doing so in a very abrupt or disconcerting way, which is what happens, of course, when we start out with something like La Cloche à travers les feuilles. Here, there's the possibility that we could imagine a sort of diatonic context for what we are hearing. However, the Debussy melody is pointedly not doing that. I made an example of the melody in isolation like this because it helps us to see how Debussy is not organizing this melody in terms of a single most prominent pitch. There's no clear tonic here. And so I think that one of the reasons why Debussy becomes very interested in the anhemitonic pentatonic is because it has the capacity, like the whole tone mode, to set up something that takes away from listeners the things that their ears would normally seek to grasp onto to locate themselves in a diatonic mode. We just don't know quite where we are, and our ear might be feeling a little bit frustrated in trying to seek out the familiar boundaries of a diatonic mode or of a tonic. And of course, that makes particular sense for this piece. Remember, the context is the image of clouds drifting in the afternoon sky, and this is something that does not convey a sense of strong direction, at least not that piece of music as Debussy creates it. He wants to give the music itself a sense of a kind of aimless drifting around according to the whims of the wind. This is not something that is goal-directed. This is not something that could be comfortably conveyed through the use of diatonic melodies. Debussy is searching for alternatives. So for all of these reasons, we might suspect that the anhemitonic pentatonic is some kind of laboratory-developed type of mode that Debussy created to be able to come up with these effects. But that wasn't the case. It was actually a World Trade Fair in Paris in 1889 that Debussy visited, where there were lots of cultural exhibitions as well, including music from Southeast Asia, from Bali, specifically the Balinesian Gamelan Orchestra. And when Debussy heard that music, he was immediately excited because he found it very sophisticated, but sophisticated in a way that the European art music of his time was not. It was not working with these obvious semitones, and therefore, for Debussy, this offered a new pathway forward for musical composition, something that he could use to create new sound worlds, just like the whole tone scale, just like the octatonic. So this is why Debussy becomes fascinated by the anhemitonic pentatonic, and it becomes so popular that we, to this day, think of it as simply the pentatonic. There are many other types of pentatonic, but the anhemitonic pentatonic once again becomes established because a composer like Debussy could use it to such tremendous compositional effect. Now, the next thing that we want to consider is not just staying within one type of mode or another, not just the octatonic, not just the anhemitonic pentatonic, not just the whole tone, not just the chromatic. What if we used combinations of these mode types? What if we took segments from each of them and put them together to come up with hybrids? That's going to be the next kind of musical experiment we'll try out, and we'll discover that that produces some rather striking mode patterns that might be familiar to us from music that we hear all around us today. In this segment, we're going to see how we can create new types of mode by using fragments of older, more familiar mode types. For example, right here I can see a familiar structure that's alternating semitones and whole tones throughout. This is one of the octatonic mode types. Starting from the note G, I could also create a whole tone mode. And what I've done is circle a portion of that whole tone mode that I will take out and reuse in combination with an octatonic segment. And you can see that here. I'll play it for you. Now, this is something that is combined into what you might want to call an octatonic whole tone scale. However, remember that octatonic is also known as the diminished scale. So what we're looking at is the diminished whole tone scale. That's how it's come to be known. And you can see how it's a hybrid because it is combining a portion of an octatonic mode with a portion of a whole tone mode. By the way, I could actually extend this to include that D flat because I have a whole tone, semitone, a whole tone, a semitone, and a whole tone. So they perfectly mesh with each other. Now this happens to be an extremely popular type of mode for many reasons. One thing I can do, for example, is create a sort of familiar jazz lick out of it. And I could even provide some harmonization for that would sound suitably jazzy, if a little bit trite. But what I'm doing there is treating the mode as its very own kind of independent musical structure. This is something that can actually be used as a model for chromaticism as well. So, for example, on a piano, I might play something like diminished whole tone, where you can hear the semitone, whole tone, and then the whole tone segment. And a lot of jazz performers learn this kind of thing because it's something that they can use to introduce chromaticism to familiar chord types. So there's one type of chord that we call a dominant seventh. I'll introduce you to that explicitly in episode 12, but it would sound like this. So this would sound to many jazz players to be a little bit too mundane. They might want to alter it a bit. I've made one chromatic adjustment, and now I can make another chromatic adjustment. And now what I have is a kind of chord type that's combining diatonic and chromatic elements. And if I wanted to improvise over top of that, you discover that the diminished whole tone scale is something that you can rely upon that combines diatonic and chromatic elements. So there are two fundamentally different ways of using the diminished whole tone. One as a mode type in and of itself without respect to diatonic this or chromatic that. On the other hand, you can use it as a tool for introducing chromaticism into a diatonic framework. So the diminished whole tone is one of the most popular types of hybrid scales, and for this course, that is the only type of hybrid scale that I'll expect you to know and to be able to name. I can, however, show you other examples. For example, Brahms' Fourth Symphony has a melody like this. Now, if I summarized all of the notes that are being used, they would sound like this. And that seems to be a rather odd collection of whole tones and semitones. And I don't think it's well understood in this fashion where I'm just summarizing everything that's being used from the lowest pitch to the highest. Instead, what I have a sense of is the melody moving in two different spheres. On the one hand, there is this upper part that I've circled here. To me, that sounds very much like the lower pentachord of A major. However, when I move down into the lower region, so there's my upper part of the melody, but it's the first five notes, the lower pentachord of a major mode. When I switch down to the lower part, it's kind of like a shadow has briefly passed over the music. And what I detect there is the opposite mode type. That is to say, the top part of a minor mode. So I've circled the part that Brahms seems to use when the melody dips downwards. So from my perspective, what we have is another hybrid where instead of building it from tonic through to tonic, the tonic is in the middle in this case. And as the melody moves above, up here, it's in that brighter major mode. And then when we move to the lower part of the melody, Brahms switches into minor. So this is a more idiosyncratic hybridization, but it shows us another way in which hybrid modes can be created out of familiar mode types. Now, the last thing that I want to do is introduce the possibility for using our kind of terminology, our awareness of modes, to listen to music that might not normally be described in these terms. What I want to listen to now is an excerpt from an Indian raga that's played on sitar, and it's going to be using a mode type that is very distinctive to this classical tradition. However, I still think that there are ways in which we can use the knowledge that we've gained through our study of modes to understand what is taking place. The last thing I want us to listen to in this episode is an example of how an Indian raga begins, which is normally with the statement of the mode on which this extended improvisation will take place. So what we're going to hear is the beginning with a drone that's playing, followed by the sitar suddenly coming in with this cascade of a scale. That is going to be the mode that's used for the sitar player's improvisation, which we're not going to listen to because we don't have time. But what we're going to be interested in is seeing if there's something about that mode that might sound familiar to us in some ways, and possibly if we can come to understand it in our own terms as a kind of hybrid of different mode types that we are already familiar with. So I'll play that for you just now. Now, one of the things that we're used to hearing, of course, is our scales being played, at least for our purposes here, from bottom to top. So I've organized things in that fashion. However, you should know that I've also talked about Greek tetrachords, and they were typically conceived from top to bottom rather than our conventional bottom to top. It's sort of like the segments of mode would hang from a higher pitch rather than building up from the lower one. And so that's what we're hearing at the start of this raga, where the sitar plays down through a scale, but does it in a way that isn't completely scale-like. There are these little melodic segments. So, ya-da-dee-dum, da-da-dee-dum, da-da-dum, and then it briefly hops down to that C and comes back up again. So I'm kind of summarizing things in a simplified fashion, and if I look at that, what I might hear, first of all, of course, it sounds so much better on the sitar than on the piano, not just because the sitar is a wonderful instrument, but it's also how the sitar is tuned. And I'll be talking about how that's done at the end of the next episode, where we discuss tuning and temperament. In any event, if I were to play this as one of our conventional scales, this is what it would sound like. Now, if we were to listen to the improvisation as a whole, what we would discover is that this is, in some sense, diatonic for that improvisation. All of these notes are used regularly. And I mention that because if I play it in this scale-like fashion, what I hear is something that my ear would probably interpret as a kind of conventional major mode with suddenly the intrusion of a chromatic element. Now, in fact, if you were to listen to the full improvisation, you would be hearing G naturals played just as often as G flats. So I can't actually decide that this is a heptatonic mode with a chromaticism that's being introduced. This is actually, in fact, an octatonic mode. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we repeat the pattern again. So this, number one, shows us how you can have different types of octatonic mode. However, there's something that we can hear in that sense of a little bit of a altered major mode, and that is, if I were to play through this scale choosing just one of these Gs rather than the other, that's why I've written them in blue, I'll play it two ways. First of all, using the G flat, and then the next time using the G natural. So here's with the G flat, and here's with the G natural. So what you might notice is that this sounds rather like a mode that is combining a familiar major for us with a familiar Lydian, a D flat major with a D flat Lydian. Now, I'm not trained in this Indian classical tradition. I don't know what the proper name is for this type of mode. However, my ear has been trained in the sort of Western tradition that enables me to recognize the structure that's being employed. And to that extent, I'm in a position to learn from this other musical tradition. So the way I want to end this episode is by reminding ourselves that there's a gigantic world of music out there. What we're learning here is something that is not the sum total of available modes. What we're hopefully getting a sense of are the kinds of modal patterns that we can use as a toolkit to engage with the music of many different cultures, of many different creators. And I hope that as you listen to music beyond the end of this course, you'll at least have acquired some way of listening analytically to the music that you're hearing, so that even if you might not know the particular language or theory that's used to describe these other types of modes, you'll still have the capacity to recognize and understand what you hear.